the beginning there was nothing. So God said, "Let there be light." He separated light from dark, calling them night and day on the first day. On the second day, God created the sky, the land, and the seas. The third day brought vegetation on the land, and God created the sun, the moon, and the stars on the fourth day. On the fifth day, there were sea creatures to fill the waters, and birds to fill the sky. On the sixth day, God created animals of all kinds to populate the land, as well as man. Now this man's name was Adam, and he was to watch over all of God's creations. However, he was missing a companion, and therefore God made Eve. Now Eve was a woman who became Adam's wife and helped him care for all God's creations. All God made was finished, and he saw that everything was good. So on the seventh day, he rested. Now let's move on to the fall of man. This begins when Adam and Eve are living their best life in the Garden of Eden after the creation. God gives them everything. However, there was one thing that they were forbidden to do, and that was to eat a fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. One day, Eve decided to take a stroll around the garden, and she found a serpent. The serpent was actually the devil, and he tempted Eve to take a bite from the forbidden fruit, which God said no to eating. Even so, the serpent convinced Eve to take a bite out of the forbidden fruit because he told her that she would have just as much knowledge and power as God. And she even convinced Adam to take a bite out of the forbidden fruit as well. At that moment, they both knew they made a grave mistake, and they broke the only rule that God gave them. They also suddenly understood the difference between good and evil, and they also realized that they were naked. So they tried to cover themselves up with the leaves around them. They were scared and ashamed. Later that evening, God took a stroll around the garden, and he looked for Adam and Eve. When he found them, he saw them hiding from him. However, God already knew what they had done wrong. Not only was he disappointed in the devil for tricking them, but he was also disappointed in Adam and Eve for even trusting the devil in the first place. Now, Adam tried blaming Eve, and Eve blamed the serpent for everything. They were banished from the garden forever. On top of that, they would experience all the hardships that we now face today, all because of the decision they decided to make with the free will that God gave them. He put angels at the entrance of the garden with flaming swords, and he told Adam and Eve that they would not live forever, meaning that they would one day die. Now this is why our world is full of corruption, injustice, and death. So what God does is select a smaller group of people out of the many and forms an agreement with them, or a covenant. The purpose of all of this is to somehow use this covenant relationship to renew his partnership with everybody in the world. Now there are 4 times in the Old Testament where God forms a covenant. He forms one with Noah, one with Abraham, one with Moses or the Israelites, and lastly one with King David. Now let's go into depth with the covenant with Noah. So Noah was a man called by God to build an ark big enough for himself, his family, and 2 animals of every kind. So Noah had faith in God, which is what saved him from being flooded, unlike everything else in the world. So God also flooded the whole entire world to take out all of the bad and evil in it so he can start new again. But the thing is, he wiped out the whole world and everything was destroyed, so he promised to never flood the entire world ever again. Next up, we have the covenant with Abraham, who is the father of the descendants who would rule the world. God chooses Abraham and he blesses him. He gives him lots of land and a huge family to live there. In return for that, God wanted Abraham to circumcise all of his descendants that lived in his house. And if he kept this promise, his life would be good and he would have a child with his wife Sarah. Now there are many challenges in Abraham's life, especially regarding his faith, but he stayed strong even when his son was supposed to be sacrificed. Now we have the Mosaic covenant, which is basically between the Israelites and God, which is Abraham's descendants through a man named Moses. Moses was actually the son of the Pharaoh, but he escaped Egypt, and through the 10 plagues and help of God, he set the Israelites free from Egypt. God called him at Mount Sinai to get the 10 commandments, which he was supposed to tell to the Israelites so they can obey them. God told Moses that if the Israelites obeyed the laws, then they would be his chosen people, his treasured possessions, and ultimately these blessings would be extended to all of his people. And the last covenant in the Old Testament, the Davidic covenant. Now, this covenant begins when Saul was Israel's first king. He was pretty nice as a king, but he was not completely devoted to the Lord, unlike God's chosen one, David, a man after his own heart, to be Israel's new king. Saul continuously tried to kill David, however, David refused to lay his hands on the Lord's anointed one. He eventually became king, and after the capture of Jerusalem from the Jebusites and 2 battles over the Philistines, David brought back the ark to Jerusalem and thus established this city as the center of Israelite worship. Having been given rest by the Lord from all his enemies and having built a house of cedar for himself, David now desired to build a house for the Lord. God promised to give David a great name, and under David's leadership as king, to provide a secured place for the nation of Israel to dwell in accordance with the original promises of the Abrahamic covenant. God also promised that a descendant of David would build the temple that David himself wanted to build, and that the Davidic dynasty would endure forever. David would never lack a man to sit upon God's throne in Jerusalem. Now recall that the covenants were supposed to restore the relationship with God and his kingdom. However, all of these covenants failed in doing so. Furthermore, the Israelites failed in worshipping one God. Since everything failed, it was out with the old and in with the new. Now let's talk about the new covenant. The new covenant is basically all the old covenant's promises that God wanted, fulfilled by one person, Jesus. We are told that Jesus is from the family of Abraham, and so he will bring the blessings of that family to the whole entire world. Jesus is the faithful Israelite who was able to truly obey the law. He is the king from the lineage of David, and so he goes about extending God's kingdom of justice and peace to all. Jesus is the one who combined all 10 commandments into one simple commandment with a twofold message. The most miraculous part about all of this is that Jesus is God. Jesus is God in human form, and he is that human that God wanted all of us to be, but we couldn't be. Unlike every other covenant, Jesus was able to successfully bring the world together in one. Jesus called people to follow him, and they all became part of his new covenant family that God always wanted. Now the Bible ends with a new kind of world. It's the same as it was before, but now everyone's more faithful. Slowly but surely, they're becoming one. However, that's not actually the end, for the end of the Bible is really just the beginning.